During the Vietnam War, every respectable artist in this country was against the war. It was like a laser beam. We were all aimed in the same direction. The power of this weapon turns out to be that of a custard pie dropped from a stepladder, 6 feet high. Kurt Vonnegut. Welcome to Rite Good, the podcast that helps you write good. They say the pen is mightier than the sword, but it is way easier to kill a guy with a sword than with a pen. We love art, it's important to us, and it's meaningful and a worthwhile pursuit, but art alone does not change the material world. What then is the purpose of it? What is the purpose of writing? Why do we do this? If we're not saving the world and we're not getting paid very well, why are we doing this? So, here to talk about this is poet Danielle Rose. Tell us about yourself. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, it's wonderful to be on. You wanted me to talk about myself. I'm notoriously bad at this.
Oh, that's okay.
Oh no, I try to stick with simple things. Like I guess people consider me a poet, and I tend to piss people off. And it might be a better idea to get into what I've done, which is I think a much better way to understand a person. But yeah, I write some poetry, I write some other things, and I really just think a lot. That's my biggest curse.
All right. Well, you said you tend to piss people off, so why don't we start with that? A while back, you pissed a lot of people off because you wrote a tweet saying, "I wish poets understood that the general population has no interest in what we do, so when we speak, we are speaking to each other. The delusion that poetry is something powerful is a straight line to all kinds of toxic positives that are really just us lying to ourselves." And people, people kind of went nuts over that.
They did, and I guess sort of looking back, I don't think that it's very surprising to me that that was the end response to that tweet. And the funniest part is really just how it was this offhand sort of. I was in a grumpy mood that day, and I just sort of threw it off before going into a standing appointment that I have every few weeks, and came out about half an hour later, and just my phone was absolutely blowing up to the point that I really couldn't even follow what was going on for the most part. But yeah, the people went absolutely nuts. Poets went really crazy over the suggestion that what they're doing is toxically positive.
Yeah, like, I mean, to me, it seems truthful. The unfortunate reality is, to the best of my knowledge, contemporary people, most regular everyday people, don't really pay a lot of attention to poetry, at least not in the English speaking world. I can't name many contemporary poets. I think most people probably can't. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but
No, I mean, I think that we get really hung up on the idea of whether things are good or bad, and we don't spend a lot of time thinking about the fact that that's the way that things are, and that we have to address that question before we can do anything else about it. There's a whole working theory of how things happen with stuff like this. I think initially the tweet came out of a moment where I had maybe seen dozens and dozens and dozens of poems that were shared on Twitter and on other social media. And everyone, all other poets, people who are already in the club, who are members of the choir that are being preached to, they all come back and they just say, this is so powerful. This is so incredible. It always ends up being some sort of a work that has a social justice bent to it. It's identity poetry. And I think that this is true in other genres of writing and art in general as well right now, that there's this desire to assert the importance of the thing in place of the thing being important.
mm,
And I think that's a big part of what I've learned over the last 7 months now since that tweet actually went out, is how much assertion exists, not just in the arts, but in social media in general. You step
Right.
onto a site like Twitter, and the material conditions of sitting down at a computer in front of your phone and typing some words out you then send out to a whole bunch of people who follow you, who are interested in what you're doing, and generally speaking, you can assume that they're going to agree with you in one way or another. It becomes incredibly easy to manipulate the world into being, or not being, it's very important that it isn't being, but into, you can manipulate the world into appearing to be the way that you want it to be. And I think that that's a lot of sort of what's going on here, is that you take an art form like poetry, which is not very popular. It's incredibly insular. It's generally controlled by a very small number of people at the pinnacle, and you get a whole bunch of people who have access to the internet. Anyone can sit down and write a poem. It's one of the things that I like about poetry is just how incredibly accessible it is. You
Mm.
don't really need a particularly specific skill set other than to have a desire to communicate with other people and to be able to either write it down or memorize it, or however you keep it in your head. And yeah, I think that it's a condition, the sort of condition of poetry in particular makes it very ripe for taking one's desires and fears and anxieties and to assert a world where those things are flattened and simplified. And so every poem ends up being powerful. It
Mhm.
has a power that we're never going to really address or deal with in any sort of a concrete way. It's just sort of this, the author said something and it resonated with me, and so it's powerful. And it's, we don't really think about what those vibrations are like or the mechanics of how we even get to that place.
Yeah, I see. I see. And I, well, I think the thing that you said that struck me too is I think it's pretty similar for short fiction. I think short fiction, which is what I write, is in a similar boat, and that
Mm-hmm.
I see a lot of short fiction writers saying, I'm changing the world with this. And not many people really read short fiction anymore. And mainly it's just other short fiction writers or aspiring writers. It's really rare for a short story to get really big.
I think that's, absolutely true. And I was listening to a recent edition of this podcast talking about the idea of every spec fiction writer, for the most part, genre fiction is aimed at film and television and screenwriting. Really, that's correct, right?
If you ask them, they'll say no, but I think
Mhm.
you're right. Absolutely. I think a heck of a whole lot of the books and stories are written with the primary goal of I want this to get adapted to the screen.
And I think that that's something that makes a lot of sense, just from a purely mechanical standpoint. Go back to the Victorian era, you had people who were getting together to read poetry. To read, poetry that oftentimes was in many ways very narrative, and it had a place within the culture where books were more accessible than going to the opera, than going, out to see something, a performance or whatever it is. And so it, the sort of drive of like, someone who wanted to be a novelist or a poet, even looking back at this point, 120 odd years, to very famous, at least in poetry circles, Rilke's letters to a young poet, and all the encouragement of the young artists to go out and do things because it matters. And I just don't really think that the written word, at least in terms of narrative, in terms of story, in terms of poetry, it doesn't exist in the same place that it did back then.
Right.
And, the pinnacle of this is to get that Marvel-esque multiverse with 40 films and so on and so forth. And so it makes a lot of sense that the aim is shifted into that era. Like, if you really want to make something that is actually powerful, I mean, that's how you're going to do that. And the capture of commerce and in service to a lot of political ideals that's going on right now is sort of caused, I'm sorry, I knocked my mic there. But in service to a lot of political ideas, it's sort of knocked off that ability of any real piece of art to be powerful outside of dictates that are coming down from the metaculture and the economics involved.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is if you don't have an audience, it's kind of unlikely that your thing's gonna change the world. Maybe that's cynical. I mean, a lesser known artist can influence other artists, but if no one's reading poetry or if hardly anyone's reading short fiction, then I don't think it's realistic to go into it going like, I write because I think I'm going to change the world with my writing. Like, how? No one's reading it.
And then it becomes very mechanical. You can look in poetry right now and you can just see an incredible amount of sameness. And it sort of goes
Mm,
back to what's going on in genre and spec fiction again, where this sort of wildly accessible range of what we have just sort of keeps shrinking down into more and more restrictive, narrow genres of right speech, and how we have shifted to defining these huge swaths of human experience and human ideas as just wrong to begin with, and it comes with this absolutely massive blowback against it. And you can see the more harmless side of that with my tweet suggesting that, like,
right.
well, these poets, 12 people are going to read this, they're also poets, they're going to gush about it, but no one else is going to come in and see this. And there are a handful of poets who have a kind of reach that goes outside of poetry, and it's not good numbers. If you're looking to try to actually write something that's powerful, you're not. And so it's,
Yeah.
you just sort of fold yourself into these genres of speech, and I use the word genre, I just really mean a bundle of emotions and responses to those emotions. And
Mm,
you can, for example, I think a lot of identity work is sort of very narrowing genre, where it sort of has this specific kind of emotional impact, and that impact, it sort of railroads us into responses in various ways. And
mm.
to when you have things that are intensely personal, that other people have decided that matters to them as well, you end up in these sort of dump yards of emotion and affect, where you just keep piling it on top until eventually it sort of falls. And I think that a lot of short fiction and literature exists in that sort of a space now.
I think I know what you mean. Yeah, there's a lot of writing about identity topics and things like that, but there's a very specific way that you're supposed to write about it. And I mean, I'm not saying there's obviously not like a law or anything, but if you write about it in a different way, you might have a harder time getting published, or you just might have a harder time developing the kind of acclaim or buzz. I've definitely noticed it with friends who write about they write Latin American speculative fiction, and it doesn't fit in with the sort of way you're supposed to, quote unquote, write that way. And it's good stuff, but they have so much trouble getting it published, or if it does get published, it's just no one recognizes it. Even the crowd that like crows on about, oh, we want diverse fiction, like, well, not that kind of diverse fiction. Ew. Oh, okay.
And it's trendy in its own kind of a way as well. I'm pretty sure that I have a career as a poet and a writer right now because I was able to coast the final sort of wave of like trans literature being very, very popular, and the it thing
Mm,
that various institutions and stakeholders wanted to put out there. And it's to the point where you sort of know who the pool of potential, say, contest winners are going to be
mm,
before anything even gets announced. My first book of poetry, At First and Then, is a small little chapbook, and it's identity poetry. It's a little book about my transition, and it's I think, based on my own experiences just in reading and experiencing other similar kinds of poetry, it's a bit different. It's a little more distant from the self than a lot of that writing tends to end up as. But even so, I stopped writing sort of personal identity focused poems a long time ago, a few years ago, just because it felt very exploitative. It felt like I had to sort of open myself up and share these very private things about myself in order to continue this hype train that I was on, and to keep getting the publications that I wanted to, and to continue to advance my career in a lot of ways. And there's been a very distinct change. I still do plenty well for myself. Is certainly not a complaint, but it's much harder these days now that I'm writing what oftentimes amounts to domestic lit for me to have things accepted out of slush piles and things of that sort. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I know what you mean to a certain extent about that weird feeling of advertising yourself as this is my identity, this commodification of the self or the personal identity. I mean, there's obviously nothing wrong about saying here's what I am or talking about this stuff like that. That's cool, but there's something that feels kind of weird and crass about it, or something in ways that's hard to articulate.
I mean, it's the way that it sort of hooks into these processes, I think, of sort of affective emotion, and how there's been so much politics that have been packed into literature of recent, and everything ends up, it's sort of this first pass is sort of, does it pass is this bad or not? Is this harmful or not? Is this something that this person needs to be canceled for or not?
Do people talk about harm in poetry? The idea too. I was wondering, like, is that limited to my little neck of the woods? I'm
Oh
terribly
no.
curious because I know
Oh,
nothing about that whole culture. I know nothing about poetry. I'm sorry.
I think it's actually very similar. It's the mechanics of how it all works is very, very similar. It's another sort of niche genre that is populated by people who are really dedicated to it, in part because it is a niche genre. It allows people so easily to be big fish in small ponds, and
Mm,
there's a kind of danger that's inherent there, because the big fish in the small pond is not very rarely the actual big fish. They're just the puffer that's managed to blow themselves up to that extent.
yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, but I mean, you've got the issue of trying to supposedly change the world with your work when you're writing for a very niche audience. But I would also kind of suggest that even if you do get that big audience, that doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna make a huge difference. Probably the biggest thing right now, superhero movies, they're huge. They couldn't even inspire us to wear a mask to the grocery store half the time to prevent the spread of COVID. So that's the biggest thing that's there right now, masked superheroes, and you could not even get a huge percentage of Americans to like wear a fucking mask, which makes me a little bit more cynical. Like if the biggest media franchise has such limited power, what is my story that is going to be read by 50 people going to do?
I mean, I think that art has subtle power, and if we want to talk about Marvel films, it has a lot more to do with how they present the world and the sort of conflicts that
Mm,
they put forth. And I don't think that it's very easy to make, say, a superhero film, and for people in our day and age to all come out saying like okay, well, this is clearly a metaphor for this. And it's the way that there are people who unironically watch Apocalypse Now as a rah war film. You're not going to be able to affect people on the base level, but what you can do is you can condition them to sort of fall into different genres of thinking, and to narrow and open themselves in those genres, in how they communicate and how they conceive of their communication with other people. If that sort of makes sense as a starting point for this, yeah.
I think so. I think that makes sense. So in terms of say art changing the world, say portraying morally correct actions in a work of art isn't necessarily going to make people enact those morally correct actions, but you're at least maybe contributing to a wider conversation.
You're contributing to a wider conversation, and you're engaging with how people respond to things. And it's the way that the way that Captain America is portrayed can affect our ideas of patriotism and nationalism and things like that. And oftentimes it has the effect of reinforcing one's own worldview. Going back to Apocalypse Now, I mean, the person who goes into that seeing it as the raw pro-war story, that they're not going to be, it's very unlikely that that is going to change, because that's a part of the way that they interact with the world. And it's they hear Flight of the Valkyries and see the helicopters swarming in, dropping napalm, and it's hoorah, and that's a good thing, and so forth, and it gives them that sort of dopamine hit of emotion, and then everything follows after that, and you go into the next experience, and the next thing that you take in already sort of railroaded into that idea. And so the next, and even when you get jarred out of it, it's still a matter of trying to take your worldview and your selfhood, and sort of stuff it back in there and say, like no, this still makes sense, I'm going to keep going.
Mm.
You're not going to have a Marvel film that convinces people to wear masks, but if we have enough Marvel films, it sort of uh, can do the work of normalizing the way that we talk about things. It certainly, I think a lot of art has normalized the way that we talk about things like race and gender and marginalized characters, but also marginalization itself. And it creates sort of genre ways of discussing this, and they are easily categorized as good or bad depending upon where you're sitting.
Mm. That can make sense. Yeah, that makes sense. But at the same time, I'm glad you brought up marginalization and identity, because I feel like there's this belief that if you present positive representation of marginalized identity in media, like, that's enough. And I'm just thinking about this right now, how we have a lot of positive representation of LGBTQ individuals in media, while we're getting these like really kind of disturbing anti-LGBT legislation that's popping up out in places like Tennessee and places like Texas. So I feel like occasionally people might focus on representation and the culture war too much and lose track of the other things. Like, I think it's good to have diverse and positive representation in media, but that's not enough. And that's the thing we're talking about more, which I find a little bit alarming.
I think that one of the few freedoms that we have, and one of the few places where there's agency to be grasped, at least easily on a day-to-day basis, is in a concept of Lauren Barant calls it lateral agency. And it's not actually going out there and accomplishing something. It's not that a piece of art change the world or be powerful, or get someone to put on a mask, or whatever sort of outcome you're looking for, but just that it provides us with just sort of a moment of rest. And you go into the Marvel film, and you watch the good guys win, and ultimately the moral story is very simple. Everything else is just sort of window dressing to it, and there's the big, huge climax battle, and it's violent, but not too violent. And you just sort of enjoy yourself for a little while. You get, an hour and a half, 2 hours of not worrying about everything else, not worrying about how you're perceived, not worrying about all of the attacks on rights, or whatever one might perceive these things to be. It just sort of gives us a moment to rest and to recuperate. And I think that there's a lot to be said as well. And this might be sort of moving backwards a little bit, but I think it's worth it to point out that there's moving into this sort of age of post scarcity. This is very much the case for television and film, and the popular arts. Music is a great example. It's there, it's accessible, it's all, you're not kept away from it. And in fact, these companies, for the most part, that they want you to just like keep going and going and binging, and you listen to one album, you listen to a different playlist. Like, it just sort of keeps the algorithm throw stuff at you constantly, and you can never stop. It's sort of the YouTube problem, but it's sort of the problem everywhere. And there are very sort of different rules. You go back to, sort of a lot of the work with Foucault and the linguistic turn, the idea that a lot of the ideas surrounding repression. And in many in many ways, I think I'd posit that our world right now, having something be, I don't want to say repressed, because that's a very sort of active process, but to not be the center of attention is an incredible thing. And it might be the space where the most amount of self-making can actually occur. It might be the place where identity is something that is calmer and simpler. There's the sort of example of anti-LGBTQ legislation, and if we're being honest, a lot of that is really it's anti-trans legislation,
Right.
and this stuff is complicated, but it goes down to, at least in terms of trans people like myself who medically transition, who go through this process, we are a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the population. I think the upper reaches of that is something like 0.7%. And a lot of the time, you step out into our world right now, and that doesn't really seem true. Just
Right.
in how people talk about things, and in sort of the attention that's paid, and stuff like that. And so there's this nagging suspicion that, that I have, that a part of what's going on here is this sort of asynchronous communication between sort of political sides, and in what you call the culture war. That is, both of them are playing to their genre, and they're on their tracks, and they've sort of had their series of emotional impacts, and now things are just sort of on rails. They're going to try to do something about it. And there's a wonder about, okay, so now we're seeing, you can look the woman who promised like 50% queer characters in Disney films going forward is the goal, and it's a little bit of a head scratcher, considering that the actual population numbers are a lot smaller, and it makes something seem much larger than it
Right.
is. And when something is sort of portrayed as so large, it becomes much more of a threat. I think it's very, very interesting the way that the conversation about trans rights that's gone since the quote unquote transgender tripping point. It was that as well. But the transgender tipping point about, a little over a decade ago, where it sort of went from these very hard fought and won protections and openness about trans people, has become something that is incredibly different at this point. It's a different population of people, and the needs of individuals under that sort of larger umbrella are oftentimes actually mutually exclusive, and it sort of ends up with these sort of inherent conflicts that need to be smoothed over constantly.
How do you mean the needs are mutually exclusive? Could you tell me about that?
I mean, I think that there are a lot of trans people for whom invisibility is the greatest hope. I can speak for myself that my life is the best when being trans is something that's sort of off to the side, and that affects my life in some deep ways. But at the same time, it's not the center of who I am when I step out into the world. And on a practical case, like, it's the idea of being involved in like, say, a pronoun circle, like
Mm.
someone asking me what my pronouns are, like no, like I fought really hard for you to not ask me that question, like,
Mm.
for me to just be able to move through life like anyone else. And the constant placing a spotlight on something for the sake of placing a spotlight on it, and oftentimes for very performative reasons, getting those little points,
Mm.
it can be a little difficult. The extent of what I need as a trans woman is access to my medications, and that's something it's not really, it's very difficult to get between an adult and their doctor. But that's what a lot of these laws are doing, is that
Right.
they are getting between people and their doctors, and which is a ludicrous kind of
Oh, an absolute violation of just bodily autonomy, medical privacy, everything. It's ridiculous.
yeah. I mean, the state has no purpose there.
No.
They're not doctors. They don't. Legislators don't understand this,
No.
and but that's sort of where things are headed. Is this sort of like over legislation of everything. And this is coming from both sides of the political spectrum as well. It's not just the anti-LGBTQ stuff. It's the pro as well. I mean, it's everything is sort of ending up in this arena that works in this particular way.
Now, how do you mean that it's coming from like the more leftward side? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
It's just the oversized emphasis on a lot of this.
Mm.
You take trans people who, on a day-to-day basis, I don't come across other trans people. I can go months and months and months without encountering one. And part of that is that I'm more of a suburban, rural type of person. So I encounter less people on a day-to-day than if I lived in the middle of a city. But
Right.
even so, it's just not. I'm the only trans person where I go almost all the time, and as a result, it's not a problem. I don't have problems. I just sort of exist as I am, and go forward with that. And it's yeah, it's you have to sort of get in the mind of some of these conservatives who have these very fear-based mentalities about things, and they log on to someplace like Twitter, and there are hundreds or thousands of people all coming together, all accessibly able to lend their utterance, which is the same as what other people are saying. It's the same thing over again.
Mm.
And it just sort of creates this idea that this problem, quote unquote, from the mind of the person who's sort of anti-trans, that this problem is huge and it's everywhere, instead of what was it, the state recently where the Republican governor vetoed the anti-trans bill, pointing out that it would affect like 3 people,
Right.
which is it's ridiculous. It should be a case by case, and that's about how far it goes. And but there's this need to sort of push things to the edges, and in our definitions, we want to expand them as much as we can, and that causes a certain kind of problem. And it also goes to the other side, that your sort of political enemy is going to see a much larger army to keep with the enemy than if they were existing in their neighborhood and their daily life and their workplace and so forth.
Okay. I think I see what you mean. Yeah. All
And
right.
it's the popular thing. It's
Yeah.
these things go in cycles, and 5 years from now there'll be a sort of a different group that has captured all of the sort of attention here and the focus of the political side of things.
Why do you think that when we write a poem or a short story, we do this telling ourselves, I'm going to change the world with this? Like, why do you think that's such a widespread thing that people say about themselves? This is powerful. This is powerful. Like, why do we feel the need to tell ourselves this?
I don't think that we have any other kind of currency. And I think that the currency is so devalued that we can just sort of throw it around. It's like that guy who, and this is all a performance, like everything is a performance. But when the ruble was so devalued during the recent invasion, I just went out in the street and started throwing it around because it isn't really worth anything. Like bill after bill after bill, just like going through the air, ending up on the ground, and some people scrounge for it, other people just step right on it because it's not really worth anything, and there's nothing there. There's no stake in it. If you say something is incredibly powerful, but it isn't, but nobody cares really, then
Right.
you've sort of asserted that it's powerful, and if the people who you're talking to agree with you, then that thing is powerful, and it creates this de facto reason for doing the things that we do, from taking that labor that could be doing something much more practical for us, it's, even as much as earning a wage to get a little bit of extra money that you can actually use and has value in one way or another. And yeah, I mean, I just think that when things have no when things have no power, then you can say anything that you want. And there's just so much that you can say whatever you want, and it doesn't really matter. I can say that flying monkeys are the real geniuses of the world, and it doesn't matter that flying monkeys don't actually exist. It just, I can make that assertion, and if I can convince other people that that's true, then I've created a feedback loop for myself where I can like really get into flying monkeys, because flying monkeys are important and it gets lost in the jumble of everything. And that's where most people are, just sort of lost in the jumble. And it carves out this little space where you have this sort of lateral agency to justify what you do by bouncing it off other people. If that if
I
that
think,
makes
yeah, I
sense.
think I can
Yeah.
get that. So you're having a great time pretending that flying monkeys are great until someone comes along and says, "You know what? Flying monkeys are bullshit. They're not real. And I don't even think monkeys should be able to fly anyway.
Canceled.
Why would I want a monkey to fly? It just means they're gonna like fling poop even further. It's terrible. It's a terrible idea."
And I've heard that flying monkeys work for evil witches.
Oh yeah, terrible.
Yeah, yeah. And then you have your whole
Sorry, you don't like a girl
mythology.
boss? Excuse me.
The whole mythology just sort of grows up around that. And then you have a mythology in poetry. These very minor figures are hailed as being incredible and life changing. And if you read this person's work, like, it'll change how you think about things. And we don't really explore that very much. Like, what does that even mean?
Right.
Like, are you actually changing, or is it just reinforcing the things that you want to believe that are true? Are these statements that are reason that make sense rhetorically? I think one of my pet peeves is that poets are horrific critical thinkers. There's a reason that most poets don't make arguments; they make statements and assertions. And I think the word assertion, to assert, is very important. It's a major part of how our culture works right now, is that we make assertions, and then the existence of those abstract assertions in the abstract realm of performative social media actually makes those assertions into a kind of relativistic truth.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. And when you start to break at someone's truth, they don't really have an argument against it, and all they can do is just sort of declare that you're a bad person.
Yeah, and then it's sort of a playbook, and
Yeah.
that's also sort of this idea of right speech. It's,
Right.
you call people out for the things that are, even if it doesn't actually affect you. And I always find it amusing coming from leftists, because it's this very Bush era, post 9/11, like if you see something, say something. It's this sort of internalization of that idea without having the understanding that that's where it came from. That seeing those posters over and over again in the subway, on TV, when you go into the airport, still at this point, it's, really been. I think Orwell would have quite a complicated field day
Yeah.
with today, and I guess it's a bit of a pet peeve for me when sort of either side of the political spectrum tries to claim him, because we are in an age that is much more authoritarian than it is democratic, to the extent that you can see articles about the end of democracy all over the place right now.
Didn't Orwell snitch too, though? Didn't he also see something and say something?
Oh,
I'm
probably.
pretty
I
sure
mean,
he
it's
was a
it's that's
snitch.
just survival. I mean, if you do what you have to do, which is, you call that hustle. But if you do that in the way that people don't like, then that becomes a problem.
Yeah, I'm looking it up. Yeah, he totally was a snitch.
Yeah, yeah.
So he's also a complicated guy, I guess. Right. Where were we? Okay. So what about this? Very frequently, when a dictator or a totalitarian authority seizes power, there's a huge clampdown on free speech, and that includes art, right? Like dictators tend to go after artists, they
Mm.
tend to
Mhm.
imprison artists, kill them, really limit the kind of art that's able to be made. So, a question is, well, if art has such really limited power, then like, why is a dictator so scared of it?
I don't know if dictators are actually scared of art or they're scared of artists who or organizers and activists and in many cases revolutionaries who happen to be artists. I think that you'd be hard pressed to find people who, you know, examples exist because examples in today's post scarcity of information age, you can find an example for everything, but it doesn't mean that it isn't an outlier. You'd be sort of hard pressed to find someone who's simply imprisoned for writing a poem. They're imprisoned because of their associations with other people, not that that's an okay thing, but the justification is not, and the threat apparently is it's not something that comes from the art, it's something that comes from the person and their actual actions. It's they went to the protest and they arrested a lot of people from the protest, and some of them were artists, and they did a crackdown and it swept up a lot of artists because a lot of artists were deeply involved in various political organizations with political affiliations, and oftentimes that they're very open about and they speak about, if not on a propaganda level, on just a sort of awareness level. I was I'm actually very interested in this question right now because we have a sort of fascinatingly inept example that's going on with Orban in Hungary right now, where there is this huge effort, and it's very inept. It's not going very well to promote right wing art. And part of my interest in this is that it's really funny, but it looks in a lot of ways, and the way that it sort of works is very reminiscent of earlier Soviet art, the sort of installing political appointees into national museums and things of that sort, and then just sort of getting these very boring, like almost memeified political pieces of art that are oftentimes not very good, and also giving space to less and less in a minimized way, but also giving space to left-wing art and leaning on left-wing art to sort of keep things moving so that they can show people right-wing art.
Mhm.
But it's incredibly similar to the idea that the Soviets had that art should be politically approved and that uh, it should push forward the Marxist Leninist way of life and things of that sort. And it's just it doesn't really work because art doesn't really work that way. Art that has a political impact is used by political people as a tool to make an impact. It's not presented as art, engaged in as art. It's engaged in as propaganda.
Mm,
You read a poem at a political event, and it's propaganda, and it's meant to advance the political that's being put forth by that particular group.
I see. I see. I'm also thinking of instances of works of art that, for better or for worse, legitimately did at least appear to my eyes to have significant political impact. One would be that film, D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a
Mm-hmm.
Nation, which, I mean, it's a film that had a very clear, I think, in many ways, political and social impact. It helped, was a big part of reviving the KKK in the United States. Like, it's hard. Oh, it's hard to say. Oh, how art isn't going to change the world. Art isn't going to do stuff like that. And then meanwhile, you get this movie that comes out and unfortunately gets very popular with this these really, really odious racial beliefs it promotes. And then suddenly you got people wearing conical hoods again. Like,
Mm-hmm.
how, I mean, would it, is it overly simplified to say like the movie did this, or sorry, like, is it just the movie, you know? Like, is it just the work of art, or do you think that if it hadn't become such a big movie, things might have been different? I mean, how much can we blame on just the social situation that was brewing in the United States at that time, and how much can we point to that movie itself? Like, how much responsibility do we assign to it?
I like to make a very stark differentiation between sort of pre and post internet in
Mm,
terms of art and culture in general, because nothing has changed the way that we interact with each other and the way that our society functions more than the internet. And you look at an example like Birth of a Nation or Mein Kampf, and Mein Kampf is an interesting example because Mein Kampf would probably be more analogous to memoir and personal writing, which is actually very, very popular right now. But to even if Mein Kampf was written today, it would probably be written as a self-help book, to be honest. It would be some sort of new agey, like, I think sort of the neo-reactionaries have done something similar. I'm not calling them Nazis, but have to a degree taken up that sort of a model with things. and,
yeah,
and sort of
yeah.
getting back to Birth of a Nation, this was at a time early in the birth of film that where suddenly things were possible that weren't really possible in a semi accessible kind of a way. You could go to the theater and you could see this film. You might even live in a place where someone got an actual copy of the reel, and they can put it up against a barn every Friday night, and people would go and see the same film over and over and over again, because you can't get on Netflix and binge on 16 different things and still have count countless other options of things to keep watching for the rest of your life, probably. I think that maybe you can look at Atlas Shrugged and Ayn Rand as maybe the closest example. But even then, I might even bring up like Jordan Peterson, who writes self-help books and is a self-help guy. You'll sort of find in the popular genres examples of exactly this, and it goes the other direction as well. The 1619 Project. There are bunches of other books that I'm probably not aware of that are stables right now, that are just, they're not poems, they're not short fictions. The best sort of poems and short fictions take stuff from that and try to make it in an individualized or an artistic kind of a way, but it's not the thing itself. Getting back to Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand, I think that might be the closest thing to art sort of having a sort of political effect that can be very tangible for people.
It absolutely does, because
Mm-hmm.
like at least half of people who read it in freshman year of college turn into an absolute dildo for an entire year.
Huh.
It's magic. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how much I necessarily agree with that assessment, but I think that it's sort of worthwhile to remember that Atlas Shrugged is propaganda. It sort of puts together a manifesto and makes a whole lot of assertions about how someone should live their life. It gives someone a roadmap, and I think in the age where we want quick beauty hacks and ways to change the kitty litter to save ourselves 2 minutes and everything like that. It's things like that are they're more appealing than we think
Mhm.
when they're sort of couched in this language of self-help, and something like Atlas Shrugged is very sort of the rugged individualism that exists in something like that is
Right.
very similar to the Jordan Peterson ideas, and a little bit sort of Joe Rogan and on podcasts and things like that. I mean, there's a reason why we're on a podcast right now, and that you're not writing an article for a weekly paper, right? And, Newsies is a cult classic in part because it looks back on this age in this romantic kind of a way and makes us feel a little bit better about a time that was very, very brutal.
Right. Right. Okay. So winding down a little bit, let's talk about you touched on it earlier, but the actual power of art. Writing a poem is unlikely to end poverty on its own. Art that we make has sort of limited power, and a lot of the power depends on circumstances outside of the art and what we do in real life. Like, are we doing actual activism, or are we making art as a substitute for like going outside and doing the actual work? So what then is the power of art really? And why should we do this as opposed to getting a side gig that like pays way better or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the eternal question, and it's not a lot of artists go through. But art is I believe very, very firmly that art, and especially a genre like a discipline like poetry and short fiction and the literary side of things, it's very much an intellectual engagement. It's an intellectual process, and to me at least, it's an opportunity to sort of make experiments and to poke and prod at things and to see how things can move in small ways. There's also, if you want to talk about a lot of overtly political art, it does exist as a record and as a primary or secondary document. While the poem about an assault is not going to do anything about the assault, it is creating a record of these things, and it's something that in however many years we will be able to have scholars look back and say, well, people were writing about this was what was important to them. And I think that it'll give an idea, oftentimes a sort of a humanization of some of these political ideas. A lot of poetry that comes out of extremity and situations of persecution. It's not going to help with that in the short run, really. Although it can maybe give a sort of a personal catharsis to an experience, but I'm uncertain about that ultimately. But I agree with Anne Carson that art is not therapy. It's not going to fix you. It's not going to fix the world. At best, it can sort of give us this lateral agency, this moment to sort of catch our breath and recharge a little bit and not be overwhelmed by the crises that are constantly pushing against us in an ever connected, always on world. It's that moment where your boss isn't sending you the 8 p.m. email expecting you to sit down and do 45 minutes of work. And it's a space where you're not worrying about your retirement account. You're not concerned about inflation. You're not in a place where you're worrying about getting the kids off to school the next day and making sure that they have the right lunches and things like that. It sort of gives us a moment to catch our breath. And it sounds very unromantic and simplistic, but I think that it's probably one of the things that we get the least amount of in 2022.
Yeah, I can see that. All right. We've been talking for about an hour, so let's start winding down. Any final thoughts, questions, or comments?
Oh gosh, I've said a lot. Probably too much.
So, no, that's fine. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, before we go, where can our listeners find your work?
My debut chapbook, At First and Then, is available directly from the publisher, Black Lawrence Press. It is available on Amazon and on a small press distribution. Those are the best places to get it. And my small, technically this is fiction. I think that I've come to categorize it as probably a short story in microprose. The History of Mountains
Hmm.
is available directly from the publisher, Variant Literature.
All right, great. We will put links to that at the bottom of the show notes so that the listeners can check it out. All right.
Fantastic.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming on and taking the time to talk to us.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I certainly went on and on for a while, so I hope some of it is useful for your listeners.
Yeah,
I hope someone
absolutely.
can do something and find some power in there.
Great. Find some power. This podcast is going to change the world. It is
Podcasts
going to
change the
end
world.
it. This podcast in particular is going to end global warming. That's it.
Hey, you said it, not me.
Yeah, that's it. I'm pretty confident. I feel pretty good about it. Okay. Well, that is all for this episode. If you like what you heard, head to patreon.com/writegood and subscribe. Until next time, keep writing good.
This has been Rite Good with Raquel S. Benedict. Hosted by Raquel S. Benedict and produced by Matt Keeley for KS Media LLC. Theme song by Surgeryhead. This has been a Kitty Sneezes production. For comments and concerns, please write to us at writegud@kittysneezes.com. That is RITEGUD @kittysneezes.com. If you'd like to support us, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/writegood.
kittysneezes.com in color.